Good afternoon. My guest today is Harlan Ellison. Welcome. You're not exactly a household name here yet, but with your new books coming out you may be soon. So I will explain to viewers what your publicists have told me about you. You were born in Cleveland, Ohio. You've been a lumberjack, a fisherman, a crop picker, a hired gunman, a truck driver, a cook, a salesman, an actor, editor, writer of novels, short stories and screenplays, and apparently you're also a generalised all-round gadfly to the establishment. What's more, say your publicists, you're 5'5", blue-eyed, dark, and have an explosive personality, a devastating wit, and the sort of almost frightening articulacy, can't even say that word, that has made you a favourite guest on TV chat shows. Now, how would you see yourself?
I wonder how they omitted mentioning that I was responsible for World War II.
I'd like somebody to write that about me, but they wouldn't. Tell me how you see yourself.
Well, I see myself as a writer. I'm a professional liar.
Right, I won't go on to the professional line for a minute, but I will go on to writing. I would call you a science fiction writer. Now, is that exactly what you are?
No, that is exactly what I'm not. The problem is that it's one of those instances of something that waddles like a duck, quacks like a duck, sheds water like a duck, but isn't a duck. Really what I write is fantasy, contemporary fantasy, in the vein of, John Collier or Roald Dahl. I take contemporary events and kind of look at them through the lens of fantasy and see what they really mean in mythic terms, which sounds terribly pompous, but it isn't. I just really tell stories.
Right, well then I've read your stories and I got very disturbed by them, and I like them very much. They have got a lot of violence in them.
There is a lot of violence in the world.
Now, you do describe things, though, sometimes in such a way that almost makes me squeamish.
Well, I'll tell you, I come from a tradition in America of the macho Western movie, where John Wayne goes into a bar with 35 other people and they pound each other senseless for 2 hours, and at the end all he's got, is a little mouse under his eye. And that isn't what violence is all about. Violence is painful, it's full of blood, it hurts people, it kills people, and I think when you lie about it, when you pretty it up, you lead people to believe that it's possible to go around shooting each other and punching each other and stabbing each other with impunity. And my stories are intended to have a very pronounced emotional effect on people. And so on occasion in a story, when it demands that, yes, I get very candid, very realistic. I did a story about Jack the Ripper. I've been fascinated by the Ripper for a long time, the way that he's become a myth, a legend. And when I wrote the story, I described in detail from the records one of his eviscerations of a woman. And it was roundly pilloried in America. I mean, people wrote me and said, I must be a Mau Mau or some sort of terrible person to write this kind of thing. But it was the reality, and I wanted to explain the story was about the nature of evil, and I was trying to show that that's always comparative, and that something that seems incredibly evil in one period of time can be merely ludicrous in another.
But you say your stories are not science fiction, but I would have defined them a little bit like that, because for one thing you set them in often a ruined world, a crumbled world. You often set them in a sort of way in our civilization, but you seem to be warning us that civilization is horrid, or it's beginning to be horrid, or that there are signs in us of some decay.
No, that's what I believe. I've spent a good deal of time in cities, in a number of countries, and they're all the same. Cities are basically dehumanizing. Cities are basically bestial. They turn people into animals. There's very little joy, very little light, and very little love. And I guess what some of my stories are saying is if you persist in cramming people like rats into a maze, they will inevitably go mad and chew each other to pieces. And in that way, I suppose they are cautionary tales.
Because you are an American, I did read your stories more as a criticism of America. I mean, maybe you are criticizing the world, but in specific terms, I think you sometimes are saying very cruel things or accurate things about America. Am I right?
Yeah, I think so. Now here's the bicentennial year, and in America there is a feast of love about how wonderful America is. And no one bothers to mention the terrible and awful things that have been done in the name of patriotism and in the name of founding a country. I dare say the same things, apply to the English. But I I think after a while, people get to praise themselves too much, and they lose sight of the fact that they have the same core of nastiness that everyone has.
Have you experienced violence yourself? I mean, directly. I mean, for instance, I read in your publicity that you have had several attempts or 2 attempts on your life.
Well, there were 2 bomb attempts on my life that came directly from a kind of political column that I was writing in America during the 60s and the early 70s, during the time of the 2 great thugs of our generation, Mr. Nixon and Mr. Agnew. I was never able to bring myself to call him President Nixon. It just wouldn't pass my lips. You know, my teeth would fall out. And a great many right-wingers got very annoyed at me, and they bombed the newspaper that I was writing for at one point and blew the rear end off it. And the interesting thing was that they had called me a half an hour earlier, pretending to be the police, saying that the bomb had already gone off, and would I mind going down there and watching the place until until other staff members could come and make sure no one stole the typewriters and so on. And I knew it was a put-on right from the get-go, and I said, I don't know who you are, but I'm having dinner, go away and leave me alone. And a half an hour later, the bomb went off, and if I had gone down, I'd have been blown up.
You told me that somebody tried to kill you with a gun.
Yeah, well, he was just a cuckoo.
Well, now tell me about it, though, because I was intrigued, because I've got a little question at the end of it.
Ah, okay. I know what the question is going to be, too, as a matter of fact. One day, I live in Los Angeles, and behind my home is about 12 acres of watershed land. And one day I was passing through the kitchen, and every time I'd pass the window, I would see a glint of light. And finally, I kind of looked out there, and I perceived that there was someone lying in the tall grass on a little plateau out behind the house. And I went and got a pair of binoculars that I have, and went into another room, and I looked, and here was a fellow lying out in the grass with a rifle aimed at my house. And I didn't know who he was, but I didn't think that was particularly friendly, so I went and found a gun that I keep in the house in a drawer, which is going to lead to your question, I'll bet you.
Maybe.
And, well, perhaps not. And I went out the front door and down the street, which is protected from the back so you can't see it, and I went all the way down and up through a gully and came up behind him and, all right, put down that rifle, I'll put a hole in your head. And down he put the rifle and took off his belt and tied up his hands behind his back and called the police, and they took him away. And he was a wacko case whom I'd met in New York some years before, and we'd been playing gin rummy, and I had cleaned him out, and he got angry at me. And he was going to come out and kill me then, but he got drafted and went to Vietnam and did 2 or 3 years there. The first thing he did when he got mustered out was to come across from New York to California, bought a rifle in Arizona, someplace like that, and found where I lived. It's not hard, I'm in the phone book, and he was ready to pot me.
I was going to ask you about your gun, but I'm going to ask you one other thing as well.
Mm.
What did you feel when you saw the man with your binoculars and decided to go round to him?
What did I feel? I have no idea. I just knew that it was a situation that should be tended to, that's all.
You had a gun.
Yes.
That is the other question I was going to ask you.
Yes.
Now, why do you own a gun?
I own a gun because, much as I would like to believe the world is a soft pink and white bunny rabbit story, it isn't. I deal with reality. I'm a pragmatist. I don't believe in Atlantis or flying saucers or astrology or Scientology or any of that nonsense. I believe that the world is as the world is, and one must deal with it as one finds it. And in America, there is an enormous amount of violence, random violence, over which there is no control. And occasionally people come around and they either want to rob your home or they want to cause you difficulty. And while I'm not the most prominent person in America, I have a rather high profile, and this has happened before. And I would be a bloody fool not to have something around that, in the crunch, I could not fall back upon. I don't like it. I must tell you, I don't like having a weapon in the house.
Your gun was loaded when you went up to that man?
Yes, the gun was loaded when I went up to
and
him.
would you have used it if he'd struggled?
If he had struggled? No, I probably would have bashed him in the face with a fist. The last thing I would do would be to shoot anyone. But if he had seen me coming and had turned around and started shooting at me, I suppose I would have dropped and taken good, careful aim and tried to knock him down. I don't think I'd have tried to kill him.
Here's a purer than thou thought coming from me now. If I lived in America, I think one of my greatest campaigns, if I could launch one, would be to say that guns should not be owned by private people.
I agree with you. I don't think they should even be owned by the police. I've gotten in trouble telling police that they should act like London bobbies and have a nightstick and not have a gun. I concur 100%.
But Harlan, I'd never hear of great movements in America saying this.
Well, it's oddly enough there is a great movement, but there's an even greater movement for guns, and it has to do with something called the National Rifle Association, the NRA. They have an enormous lobby in Congress, and they are supported by the arms manufacturers, the munitions makers, and they have millions, I don't mean thousands, but millions of people who are members of the National Rifle Association. And these people, if a politician suddenly says we should not have guns, there will be 500,000 letters on that man's desk the next day. They will send. They've done publicity campaigns against politicians. They have defeated politicians who have been for gun control, and it's amazing that we have the small amount of gun control that we do have in America at this point, which has come about only because of terrible things like the assassination of Martin Luther King and the shooting of George Wallace. We have controls. We do have laws. It's just that guns are so easy to come by. I mean, there are states where they're manufactured and you can just ship them right across the border and nothing is done about it. Well, when I was a kid, I lived in Ohio, which most people think of as being the rational, sane heart of America because it's right in the middle. And a great many notable people have come from Ohio, James Thurber and Milton Caniff, the cartoonist, and people like that. I lived in a town about 30 miles northeast of Cleveland, a very small town called Painesville. And I'm Jewish, and there were no other Jewish kids my age in the town, and I was constantly getting thumped. They used to knock on me like I was a door. I had to fight my way from school every day. And it was a very early education in the nature of bigotry and in the nature of hatred that has no rational background to it. And I fought ever since I was a child. And it was so bad that I had no friends. I had none whatsoever. I mean, you hear kids say, well, I had a miserable childhood and I didn't have any friends. But they always had one or two. I didn't have anybody. I was all alone, and it made me, I suppose, a cynical kid and a mean kid, and I got in a lot of trouble. And I always fought back. And eventually I just ran away when I was 13, ran off and started living on the road. And that's why that long list of silly jobs that I held. I mean, when you're unemployed and unskilled, I sit before you a classic example of a self-made man, thereby demonstrating the horrors of unskilled labor.
Well, I was listening there with my mouth open practically because I mean, why did your parents stay in that place if you were the only Jews there?
Well, circumstance, of course. I never found this out until my mother was on. My mother dies regularly. She's been dying for the last 10 years. She's about 82 years old. She keeps having these massive heart attacks that would kill a Tyrannosaurus. And one time, I keep her down in Miami, Florida, right? Where else would you keep a Jewish mother? Dorset, right? So, and I went to see her in the hospital in Miami Beach, and there she was with a tube up her nose and all. And she says, deathbed, I must tell you about your father. And my father died in 1949 when I was still fairly young, and I never knew him very well because I was always on the road. I had run away a lot. And she began telling me the most wonderful and amazing things about how he had run booze during during Prohibition and had gone to jail for taking the rap for a guy who was also driving for him, who had 3 or 4 kids. I thought it was dynamite. I thought that was sensational. Why should she be ashamed of a thing like that? I mean, it was great. And so my dad had just gotten out of jail. And he went to work for my uncle in a jewelry store, and my uncle had the jewelry store in Painesville. And we didn't have the money to go anywhere else. I mean, he had no other place to go, and so I was stuck there. And I suppose an awful lot of the trouble was caused by the fact that I'm a big mouth. If I'd been a nice, quiet kid, and tugged my forelock a lot, I'm sure I wouldn't have gotten crushed so much. But then I probably wouldn't be writing the kinds of things I'm writing today.
When did you start to write the kind of things you're writing then?
Well, professionally, I've been writing for 20 years.
You've done Batman and Star Trek and Valley of the Dolls, all sorts of things, haven't you?
Yeah, well, I've written a lot of television in the last 15 years since I moved to Los Angeles. But I've been writing books for 22 years, books and stories. But the first thing I ever wrote and sold was when I was 10 years old. I sold a 5-part serial to the Cleveland News, to the young people's column. It was a direct steal from Sir Walter Scott. I mean, just dead on. And then I followed up with my second big success, which is a direct steal from Rider Haggard. And after that, I just kept right on writing. I've always written. No matter what else it was I was doing to earn a living, I was always writing.
Can you, in less than a minute, tell me about the story which I'm told is one of the best science fiction stories ever written, I Have No Mouth and I Must Scream?
I will try. The background of the story is that the Third World War starts, and the three major powers, China, Russia, and America, find that the war is so complex that they cannot handle it just with people trying to program it, and so they build giant computers to handle all of the tactics. And fearing that they'll be bombed, they sink them into the earth far down in caves. Eventually, the computers link up and they take over the world, program the war so that all human beings are killed. And the story is about the last 5 human beings that are brought down into the center of the earth, inside the belly of this giant computer that fills the earth, and it torments them endlessly.